in this section, we will look at Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, particularly the themes that are introduced in Daniel chapter 1, which are very foundational to the entire book. In other words, everything that is introduced in Daniel chapter 1 will also permeate the entire book. It will keep on recurring. Some of them are introduced with a bang, and that's it, are not repeated. Most of them are repeated. Most are repeated. I will show you which ones are those. A few, they are introduced once, and that's it. You don't find it. And it's just this topic, then move on. Okay? And as we have mentioned, they are very foundational in the book in understanding the entire book. Actually, we have already introduced theme number 1. Theme number 1. When we read Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, the theme is God is in control. This theme is going to permeate the book. We serve a God who's not taken by surprises. The God who does not have a crisis. When we fell into sin, it was human crisis, it was not God's crisis. Because by the time we fell into sin, God had already came up with a solution. He simply picked the solution and applied it. Now some we can say, Lord, but you knew that humanity was going to fall into sin. You knew that the Israelites would commit sin and be sent to exile. Why didn't you prevent that? Again, God has created us to be human beings with choice. He gives us a choice, the power of choice. The power of choice. But then he makes a provision that should they choose other gods, how will I reclaim them? He gives us power of choice, then he comes up with a redemption. Redemption. I give them power of choice. They should worship me because they love me. They must choose to love me. But should they choose to love somebody else, I will go out of my way to go and reclaim them. Should they commit sin, as in the Garden of Eden, I will come up with a strategy to bring them back home. I will tell them to leave the garden because you can't stay within the holiness when you have committed sin. The holiness will destroy you. And we read passages that would say, it is because of your mercies that we are not consumed. So the very first theme that is introduced is God is in control. This theme will play itself as we move into the book. For instance, let me give you a typical example. In Daniel chapter 2, God reveals the future through Nebuchadnezzar. He reveals it through Nebuchadnezzar. Now, ordinarily, God should take the future and give it to his children to reveal it. But because he's in control, he can use anyone, even those who are worshipping idols. But remember, when we look at them, we see the Babylonians. When he looks at them, he sees his children. His children who are supposed to benefit in the redemption. So the children of Israel, they are in Babylon, and God is still in control. God reveals the future through Nebuchadnezzar. He shows the fact that he's in control. Daniel chapter 3, the 3 Hebrew boys in fire. They are in the furnace they are in the fire, heated 7 times. And God shows up, one like the Son of God, like the Son of the gods, according to Nebuchadnezzar, the Son of the gods. But we know that when we read the story from Daniel, he actually saw Jesus Christ himself. He saw Jesus Christ himself. Chapter 4, to show that God is in control. This is also the story of judgment of Nebuchadnezzar. You remember he was dethroned, and for 7 years he lived like an animal. And when he repented, then God accepted him back. Chapter 4 proves that God is in control. Chapter 5, when his articles, which were stolen or taken from Jerusalem, temple in Jerusalem, transported to Babylon, and they are now used by Belshazzar in his party. God shows up and he writes, your numbers, your days have been numbered. You have been weighed on the balances and you have been found wanting, showing that God is still in control. Chapter 6, Daniel is in the den of lions, and God saved him from that. Now we can go on and on. In Daniel chapter 7, God reveals the future. God reveals the future through Daniel. Chapter 8, God reveals the future again through Daniel. Chapter 9 is an explanation of Daniel chapter 8. Chapter 11, chapter 12, up to chapter 12, the end of the book, we see God active. We see God active, proving that the theme that was introduced in Daniel chapter 1 will play itself in all the chapters of Daniel. You see God very much active. You see God, he's not taken by surprise. He has a plan. Actually, because he's in control, he can see the future. He can see the future. The children of Israel were not in Babylon just for punishment. Yes, they had committed sin. They were going through a punishment. But there was another agenda. The missionary agenda by God. The missionary agenda. Why? God had been wanting to reach out to the Babylonians. And when the children of Israel committed sins, he said, okay, I will punish you, but the punishment is to make you missionaries. Go. I want sinners to go and reach out to other sinners. So sinners were reaching out to other sinners who were in Babylon. And this came from Jerusalem. And this has been the pattern of how he works. Even in the story of Joseph, there's a crisis. They are fighting within the family. In the book of Genesis, Joseph and his 12 brothers, he has these dreams that angered his father together with the brothers. And the brothers ended up selling him to the Ishmaelites. Now, when you read that story, you see a terrible story. It's a crisis. The family is you see disunity in the family. They sell Joseph, and you say, oh, this is a terrible story. He lands in Egypt. But then, that is the story from the human eye. But if you look at the bigger picture, God, what are you trying to do? I'm actually trying to reach out to the Egyptians. So God has an agenda. It is the God that has an agenda. And his agenda is to save. Is to save. And within his control, he's not controlled because he loves power. He is in control because he wants to use this power to liberate his children. Okay, this is theme number 1 now. This is theme number 1. Now let's go to other themes. I'm going to remove this part here. This part here. Theme number 2. The theme of judgment. Although the word judgment is not introduced in Daniel chapter, it's not mentioned in Daniel chapter 1, but the acts of judgment are demonstrated. How are they demonstrated? God is judging his children. His children are under judgment. The reason why they are in Babylon is because they are going through judgment from God. So you see this judgment in Daniel chapter 1, directed to the Israelites. But now when you go to chapter 4, the judgment is directed to Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5, judgment is directed to Belshazzar. Chapter 6, there is a judgment by Darius on Daniel. Maybe I should also add and say in chapter 3, there is also judgment by Nebuchadnezzar on 3 Hebrew boys. This is a judgment that is directed towards God's children. Chapter 3 and chapter 6. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 is a judgment by God on on secular kings. You also read about the story of judgment in chapter 7, where judgment is given in favor of saints, of the saints. This is now Daniel 7 verse 22. You also read about judgment in chapter 7, which is normally called the investigative judgment. Okay, judgment. This is a long story. We will come to that when we deal with Daniel chapter 7. There is also the judgment of the little horn. Of the little horn in chapter 7. Judgment of the little horn. So, Daniel chapter 7, the theme of judgment that is introduced in Daniel chapter 1 continues throughout the chapters. Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9 are also a form of a judgment. Remember, in the time of the Israelites, the atonement was perceived as judgment. So this judgment, it's the Old Testament atonement, where the Daniel 8 verse 14, unto 2,300 years or literal days, the sanctuary shall be cleansed. The cleansing of the sanctuary is actually judgment. Up to chapter 12, chapter 11 and also chapter 12, we also find the themes of judgment. It's particularly in Daniel chapter 12. At that time, Michael will stand and intervene for his children and judge those that have been persecuting his children. So the theme of judgment, it's vibrant in the whole book, beginning with chapter 1 and chapter 2 also. Chapter 2, judgment is mentioned in terms of the second coming. The second coming, where the stone destroys other kingdoms, and that stone becomes a kingdom on its own, the kingdom of God. This is Daniel 2 verse 44. So, we started with the theme of God is in control. We mentioned that it permeates the entire scriptures. The theme of judgment also going through, permeating all the layers of prophecy from chapter 1 up to chapter 12. Okay? Another theme. Maybe let me remove this part here. Theme number 3. Theme number 3. Theme number 3. Theme number 3. Theme number 1, it's God is in control. Theme number 2, the judgment. Judgment by God, or judgment on God's children, or even investigative judgment, or even judgment of the little horn. All types of judgments. Theme number 3, the theme of remnant. The theme of remnant. Now notice, in chapter 1, the word remnant is not mentioned, but remnant people are mentioned in chapter 1. And the story will be repeated throughout the book. In chapter 1, remnant people are revealed in terms of food. Food. When everyone else eats menu that has been designed or as given or prescribed to everyone, the remnant, that is Daniel and his friends, plus his 3 friends, they choose to eat vegetables plus water. They actually say to the person who was in charge, test us for 10 days. Test us for 10 days. Just test us for 10 days. We will subsist on this menu. We will eat this. And after 10 days, the book says they looked good. They looked better than other people who were not eating this menu. Now, the theme of the remnant is introduced when everyone else is doing what is prescribed by others. The remnant people choose to eat the menu from the book of Genesis chapter 1. The menu that is prescribed by God. So others are doing what others want. The remnant do what God wants. Now, is this theme repeated elsewhere? In chapter 2, there is a vision, or there is a dream. There is a dream that is forgotten by Nebuchadnezzar. And the remnant people are able to pray, and God revealed the dream, plus the interpretation of the dream. Everyone else could not remember the dream. Even the one who dreamed the dream did not remember it. Others could not remind Nebuchadnezzar or even remind and interpret. But Daniel and his friends chose to go and pray. And after prayer, God revealed the dream to them and also the interpretation of the dream. Chapter 3, I would say God would reveal the dream itself and its interpretation to the remnant. Chapter 3, when everyone else is kneeling on the image, the remnant people choose not to kneel. Chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar remembered his dream but did not understand the interpretation, in chapter 4, the remnant were able to come up with an interpretation. Chapter 5, when there was a writing on the wall, the remnant represented by Daniel, the remnant people were able to explain, to read and interpret the writing on the wall. Chapter 6, when everyone else was instructed through the law of the Medes and the Persians to worship Darius, the emperor, the king, Daniel chose to be consistent in worshiping his God. So everyone else is worshiping a human being. Daniel chooses to worship his God. In chapter 7, God would reveal the same truth that was revealed in Daniel chapter 2. He would reveal it through Daniel. And also Daniel chapter 8 and chapter 9 up to chapter 12. God reveals the visions, the history of the world, how it will unfold where it will end. He reveals it through the remnant. Now, as it is written in the Old Testament, God will not do anything, will not meet judgment before revealing it to his prophets, before revealing it to his remnant. Always. So the theme of remnant is very strong, although the word remnant is not found in the book, but the remnant people are found in the book. Okay? Theme number 4. I'm going to remove all of this. Theme number 4. Theme number 4. We have already alluded to it, which is, we've mentioned that few of those are introduced once, they are not repeated. So here's one of them, that food is not neutral. Eating is not neutral. Notice, Daniel and his friends are in Babylon. Not because they chose to be in Babylon. They're in Babylon because they are in exile. They have been captured, they were besieged, and they were marched, taken, conquered, then marched from Jerusalem to Babylon. So a very long march, protected by the Babylonians. No choice whatever. No choice to be in Babylon. To be in Babylon. No choice. But to be in Babylon. They had no choice of being in Babylon. But they had a choice in what to eat. Now you can think that, you can look at the story and say, well, these kids, maybe, normally when you have been captured, defeated, your gods, you are supposed to be bitter. You are supposed to say, but why did God protect me from these people? But they had this attitude that, well, our God is more powerful. If he allowed this, then he has a purpose. Let's not fight it. Let's pray that he reveals his purpose. When they are faced with personal choices. Now this was not a personal choice. They had no choice in being in Babylon. But when they are faced with personal choices of their offered food to eat, they say, no, we will rather eat food prescribed in Genesis chapter 1. They choose. And this is the body language of a remnant person. They don't eat anything. They don't eat anything. They don't worship anything. They worship God and they eat what he prescribes. This is the behavior of the remnant. And you will be seeing this. This is now in chapter 1. In chapter 1, it is revealed by the choice of their food. In chapter 2, we've mentioned that it's a theme that is introduced once and it is not repeated. So this is not repeated. It is introduced and it remains there. So, in other words, God is saying, I don't have to repeat this. It's enough in chapter 1. That issues of food are not neutral. They are not neutral. Now notice, this theme of food, it's not neutral. When you go to the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve fell into sin. In the context of falling, there was food. There was food. We are in this sinful situation because of food. Because of food. This is in Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2, and chapter 3. Now, when Jesus Christ, in Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus Christ was tempted, remember there were 3 temptations, and one of those temptations included food. Turn these stones into bread. Eat. God will supply your need. Eat. And in other words, break the fast. You don't have to be hungry. Eat. And the servant of the Lord says, Ellen White, Jesus Christ began his ministry, and he even went to a point where Adam and Eve fell. That's where he started. And he became victorious at the foot of food, at the level of food, where when Matthew 4 was a repeat of Genesis 2 and 3. When Adam and Eve fell, when they were not hungry, but they ate. Where Jesus Christ chooses not to eat when he has been fasting for 40 days. For a long time, 40 days. And they had not been eating for 40 days. And this was a good timing for the devil to say, okay, here Adam and Eve fell at the level of food. He's hungry. Let me get him also and say, listen, you need to understand why they fell. Food, but you can't do anything to food. But his victory started right at the fall of Adam and Eve. He became the victorious at that point. So the food is not neutral. It's not neutral. Now, no wonder so many diseases are linked to food. Today, we are going through a lockdown. Why? Because of coronavirus. Why coronavirus? You can link it to food. Because it is, scientists are claiming that even those in China, they're saying this virus, almost everyone the first patients, all of them were linked to wet market, meat market in Wuhan, meat market. And you know, at that market, they ate everything. If you can download some YouTubes and check as to what kind of meats, you'll be surprised what people eat. Food has always been our problem. Has always been our problem. Now notice Revelation chapter 22, 2 to 4. John describes the New Jerusalem, and he mentions that there is a river of life that comes from the throne of God and going through the city and watering the two trees, the tree of life. They are connected, but they are separate. Connected, but separate. And the river goes between them. But now the description of the tree, whose leaves are for the healing of the nation. Another food. Or fruit. Maybe let me use the word fruit because it was a fruit in the Garden of Eden. Another fruit is mentioned, but this time the leaves for healing. Our fall was in the context of a fruit and a tree. Our redemption was in the context of food. Jesus Christ's temptation was in the context of food. In the book of Revelation, when we are saved, there's going to be food also. And we read verse 5 of it, that the purpose for eating from the leaves, from eating from those leaves, the purpose is for sin not to come back again. So God is solving the problem of sin once and for all. So food is not neutral. Paul would repeat the same theme and say, whether you eat, whatever you eat, make sure that you glorify God. So food is not only the issue of the stomach, it is also the issue of glorifying God. So this is another theme that is introduced. It is introduced, but it is not repeated. It is repeated elsewhere, but not in the book itself. Another theme that we find in the book of, in chapter 1, the end time. The theme of the end time. In other words, a time a time that begins and a time that ends. So there is a time that begins and the time that ends. It is introduced in in small portions. For instance, Daniel says to the keeper, test us for 10 days. For 10 days. From day 1 up to day 10. Then check after that. Now, day 1 was the day when Daniel was talking to the guy. Day 10 was going to be the fulfillment of what he promised. Test us. So, the concept of time or prophecy is introduced right in the time that begins with the prophet and the time that goes into the future, that is fulfilled in the future. Test us for 10 days and see. And after 10 days, they looked better than any other person. Now, the very last, I think it's chapter 1, verse 20. After 3 years, the passage says, Daniel and his friends were 10 times better than anyone in Babylon when the king tested them. This was after 3 years of their lessons. After 3 years. So it was like a degree, 3-year degree. So when they were tested, they were 10 times better. So also it's the year from year 1 up to year 3. The concept of time that begins and time that ends is introduced right in chapter 1. But then as we go into the book, it's going to be prophetic time. Now when we go to chapter 2, we get time from Babylon up to the second coming of Christ. A very long time from the time of Babylon up to the second coming of Christ. And chapter 4 of the book of I was referring to chapter 2, where Daniel chapter 2, where there is time from the prophet, from Daniel himself up to the second coming of Christ. When you read chapter 4, Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is condemned to live like an animal for seven times. 7 times. I think we know by now that times refers to 7 years. 7 times equal to 7 years. 7 years. And the concept of times, and dividing of time was introduced at the beginning, chapter 1. It will be repeated, and it will also be repeated in Daniel chapter 7, where we find the prophecy of times, dividing of time. Then when we go to chapter 8, there's a prophecy of 2,300 days. When we go to chapter 8 of the book of Daniel. Chapter 8. Chapter 9, the prophecy of 70 weeks. Chapter 9, 70 weeks. 70 prophetic weeks. In other words, the point is, the concept of the end time is introduced in chapter 1. It is repeated, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 4, Daniel chapter 4, Daniel chapter 7, 8, 9, and up to chapter 12. Up to chapter 12, you still find times, and dividing of time, and other time-linked prophecies. So, the themes that are found in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, are introduced and are repeated as we move into the book itself. I think just to wrap this, we have the theme of God is in control, the theme of the judgment, the theme of remnant, the theme of food, the theme of time that begins and time that ends. So these are the themes that you find in the book of Daniel. Now we are ready to move to another section. The section that we'll be looking at is the tools of interpreting the book of Daniel.